Hi, welcome to this masterclass on wellbeing as part of Diva Lesbian Visibility Week. My name's Claire Harvey from Anata Limited, and I'm going to be taking you through this pre-recorded session. The reason I've pre-recorded it is so that you are able to stop and pause it and reflect it and spend time talking about it or just reflect on yourself, whatever works for you. So we're going to be talking about well-being and how to maintain positive well-being. For me, there is too much conversation around what to do when things go wrong and not enough around how to protect our well-being in the first place. So that's where we're going to focus our time today. So let's first think about well-being and what do we actually mean? Well-being is one of those words that get bandied around quite a lot, and it can mean different things to different people. I love this definition. You can have whichever works for you. This really works for me. A state in which every individual realizes her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to contribute to her own community. And for me, that contributes everything in our life, not just are we eating well, are we sleeping well, do we feel okay on the inside, do we feel we have positive mental health, are we okay at work but don't feel okay at home, or vice versa. It's a really holistic view, and I'm going to encourage you throughout this session to think holistically. So before we really delve into the bits that I'm excited to be sharing with you, I'm going to cover the basics: sleeping and eating. And I've purposely not gone into a lot of detail with these because there's lots of stuff available in this space. I want to cover some things perhaps you haven't thought so much about before. So we all know that healthy eating is really important. You can see here some suggestions. Really eating lots of fruit and vegetables, cutting down on that fast food and sugar, and being active, drinking lots of water, and importantly, don't skip breakfast. There's a great saying that says, breakfast like a king, lunch like a peer, and dinner like a pauper, because our bodies are designed to be front loaded, and the more carbs we put in after kind of evening, the more our body's not going to be able to utilize that. But predictability and patterns are very important to both our body and our brain. So whatever works for you, whatever you find is your solution, just make sure you maintain that routine throughout, because your body really relies on a predictable pattern of when it's going to get what nutrients. And secondly, sleeping. A couple of things I want to draw your attention to sleeping. There's no right way of finding a sleeping pattern. You'll find lots of advice about don't use technology, do this, exercise first, wind down, often contradictory. It's trial and error. Work out what works for you, but absolutely make sure you're getting enough sleep for you. What you cannot do is catch up on sleep. What you can do is front load sleep. So I'm an athlete. I know that there are times because of competitions that I'm going to get less sleep. So in the run up to those competitions, I get more sleep, because you can bank the benefits of sleep, but you can't catch up with it afterwards. Think of it like a piggy bank. So really think about your sleeping, not just on a day-to-day, but think about what's happening in your life and what routine you might want to develop. So enough about those two very basics. I want to cover a few more interesting things. The first thing that's really key to our well-being is to spend time genuinely reflecting on how you're feeling and talking about how you're feeling. Now, there are lots of ways to talk about how you're feeling. Some people find it really uncomfortable. Other people find it really easy. For those people who find it really uncomfortable to say the I am feeling this, or I am sad, or I am whatever it is you are, this drawing that you can see here is called a mood mountain. And I would always recommend it's a really great way to communicate feelings when perhaps you're in that space that you don't want to talk about it. It's really also good with teenagers and young people for whom mental health is a real issue at the moment, to help them to be able to articulate how they're feeling without having to own that conversation. You can draw your own mood mountain. What you'll see on the mood mountain is lots of different things going on, from being happy to falling off the edge, to feel like you're pushing a big boulder up a hill, to clinging on with your fingernails, to pushing someone else off the edge. So you can have a lot of fun creating your mood mountain, but then you can use your mood mountain to be saying throughout today, actually, I'm this person, I'm that person today, or I'm kicking that person off the edge, or even just pointing to the things that you're having. Recognizing that in any week, even in any day, sometimes we're going to go through 5 or 6 or 7 of these various moods. When we can start to recognize those, we can start to understand the pattern, and we can start to reflect on what's happening and what's making us feel those things, and therefore what do we want to change or what do we want to not. The other thing you'll see on this slide is fine. Personally, I would ban this from the English language. The last thing we want is the fine conversation. How are you feeling? Oh, fine. Is that all right? Oh, yeah, fine. What we mean when we say fine is feelings I'm not expressing. So when you feel the need to say fine, just try and stop yourself and think about how you're really feeling and be a bit more honest. But equally important, when you're asking people how they're feeling, don't be doing it in a way that means you're just moving past and you don't really want to hear the answer anyway, but you're also not accepting when they say fine. You're pushing just a little bit more in order to think about what that means. The way we can use to reflect on our feelings, there's lots of different ways. The way I particularly like is the 5 ways of thinking. So whenever I feel something, I go through 5 levels of why. So I'm grumpy today. Why do I feel grumpy today? Because I got up much later than I was expecting to. Why did I get up much later than I was expecting to? Because I'm on my period and therefore I had a disturbed sleep. Why did I have a disturbed sleep on my period? Because I probably ate lots of chocolate the day before, because that's what happens to me when I'm on my period. Why did I eat lots of chocolate? Because I hadn't thought about it far enough in advance, and therefore I hadn't really gone and got some good healthy snacks to keep me going and not have chocolate in the house. That's a silly example, but you can really start to unpick the why. So for example, if you're a person who's really driven by validation and you need validation from other people, try and work out what's causing that validation by using something like the 5 whys of thinking to get to the real root cause of the feeling, rather than just firefight the individual feelings that you're having. So let's think about what's happening when our well-being's not so positive. And I've purposely put this up front because I want to get onto the positive stuff later. When we don't feel able to cope with those stresses and demands of our life, we call it stress. It's a response to a situation that a person perceives to be overwhelming, where we don't feel like we can meet the demands of a situation. Perceived is a really important word, because it doesn't matter whether you can or you can't. It's about how you feel, and what you feel stressful, somebody else might find really easy, and vice versa. So it's a very individual thing. As humans, we're very bad at judging each other, and we're particularly bad at judging each other in this well-being space. If I don't feel like it should be stressful, then I don't understand why you would find it stressful. Remember that stress and everybody's levels is a really, really personal thing. Why do people often feel stressed? This was a study done last year, and these are some of the common reasons why people might feel stressed. The increased workload, long hours, particularly at the moment in isolation. I think whilst we often talk about remote working being an opportunity, actually I think in that transition, people feel like they need to be online 24/7, and that can really add to our sense of ability to meet the demands asked of us. If we don't feel valued, that can be a real driver of stress. I'm going to unpick that in a little bit. Worrying about financial situation can be a real cause of stress. Not feeling like you've got enough support around you, questioning your job security, and going through periods of uncertainty and change. I did a webinar earlier in the week about building resilience in uncertainty, and I would recommend, if that's something that's relevant to you, you go back and visit that and have a look at some of the tips in there. So if these are things that cause us stress, we can really think about what does that look like on more of a macro level. So we know that young adults will say that they feel stress over 12 days a month, and 69% of those worry about the impact on their health. I've pulled out some stats here about women and some stats around the UK to really just give you time to reflect. And again, you can pause this here and spend some time looking at it in more detail and reflecting on it, about what causes people stress, and what do you do in order to relieve some of that stress. Again, what you might want to do is spend some time reflecting on the last few times you felt stressed and what was going on for you at that point. Was there a pattern? What were you feeling stressed about? And what did you do that either made that stress feel more prolonged or perhaps relieved some of that stress? Start to build up that toolkit of what you know works for you. The next thing we can do is recognize our own levels and behaviors. This is the Ikes Dodson curve, and what it tells us that we perform at our best when we've got a little bit of stress in our lives, but it's not too little and it's not too much. But again, recognizing that this is an individual journey, and where somebody's curve is will be very different for someone else. So you can think about, when do you perform at your best? What's that optimal level of stress looking like for you? And what are the behaviors and patterns that you can recognize in yourself that might mean you're somewhere else on this curve? We talk a lot about too much stress and what that does to our well-being, but we actually know that too little stress can also have the same impact. It can make us feeling unmotivated, bored, frustrated, disinterested, lethargic, and all those great chemicals that our bodies need can get turned off. So we need to make sure we've got some stress and some challenge in our lives, but it absolutely does not tip over into that too much box. And when it does start to go in that direction, we've got some mechanisms to bring ourselves back. So you can spend some time thinking, what are your levels? Where would you put yourself here? And what are the behaviors that you recognize in yourself that mean you might be where on this curve? Again, you can pause this and spend as much time as you want to on this, even talking about it with people that might be around or on the phone if that works for you. The second thing we can do is that with this is almost use it as a speedometer. Where am I on any given day at home and at work? Because what we don't want to do is mean that at work we're towards the middle of the high end, so we've got a lot of stress going on, and we've got the same going on at home, because that's going to increase our sense of inability to manage that stress. Equally, there might be times when you've got loads of stress going on at home and it's things that are outside of your control. And so you might make a conscious decision to lower the stress and lower some of the challenges that you're facing at work, and take on different roles or not take on additional stuff in order to balance that out, or vice versa. So map for yourself, where would you find yourself on this curve on an average given day, at home and at work, and whatever those two things mean for you. And what does that mean about your overall stress level? Where could you make changes? What's in your control? What's out of your control? So I want to switch just a little bit now to think about the positives, to think about what must we have in our lives in order to have really positive well-being. These are the big four in order to feel genuinely happy. Without these four, it's virtually impossible to feel genuinely content and happy. So the first is positive relationships, really meaningful relationships, not transactional relationships, not people that we work with but we don't really trust or know or connect with. Those people that we can go to. I call them my personal boardroom. Who would you just pick up the phone to? Know will give you good advice, know will listen without judging, and know that you really feel a personal connection with those people. You can be surrounded by people but still be very lonely, or equally, you might have one or two really key people in your personal boardroom, and that's all you need. Again, a very personal decision, but just spend some time thinking about how positive are the relationships you have. Again, you might want to do this at home and at work as a nice comparison and as a nice way of thinking about things. Totally up to you. The next thing we need to have is a sense of purpose. Can I see what I'm doing on a daily basis impact something that matters to me? Now, again, this is a very personal thing. I know many people in the workplace that think the bottom line of the organization, how well the organization does, how profitable the organization is really important to them. I know other people who don't really care about that at all, but care about changing the world or saving the environment. And they can see what they do in their job, for example, is a small piece towards saving the environment. We have to be able to see on a daily basis how what we're doing is connecting to something that really matters to us. The third thing is a sense of progress. We need to be able to look back and see that we are making progress, no matter how small that is. So perhaps at work, I might take an hour to do something and I'm really struggling to do it and I'm not very happy with it at the end. But perhaps I can look back and say, last week it took me 2 hours to do it. And now I feel a little bit happier with where I can getting. We spend a lot of our time thinking how much further we have to go, how much more we have to achieve, what's next in our lives, without really thinking about where we've come and how we've come back. It's really important that for ourselves, but the other people around us are able to give us that sense of progress and enable us to see that we are moving forward, no matter how small those increments might be. And the last thing is a level of autonomy. We have to bring our own authentic selves forward in what we do and how we do things. Now, that doesn't mean, unfortunately, that we get to do whatever we want, how we want, when we want, but it does mean that we have to feel like we've got some skin in the game. We've got some sense of bringing ourselves to how we do things and some level of decision making. Again, a very personal thing. This might be more or less important to you than one of the others, but it is important. So just spend some time looking at these four things and thinking, if I had to map myself almost on a spider graph of how much I have these in my personal life or my work life altogether, whichever works for you, just map them out and think about what does it tell me and where are the areas I might want to focus a little bit more. The next thing we need to think of once we've got that internal sense of well-being and happiness is, how does that feel in our interactions with others? And we need to think about, how do we maintain psychological safety? Psychological safety is really key in order to thrive and not just survive. There was a session earlier in the week by Gina Batty around psychological safety. So I'm not going to go into any great detail, but we can break psychological safety down into four components for you to reflect on. The first is it safe for me to learn? Can I admit my mistakes? Or when a situation happens, am I looking for other things to blame? Am I looking for who's going to take the blame? Am I trying to kind of mitigate and cover up that mistake for fear of judgment from it? The next thing is it safe to challenge? Can I constructively debate things? Can I disagree? Can I say that that doesn't work for me individually and propose something else without there being a negative consequence? The third thing is it safe to engage and collaborate? So can I really give things to people, or do I need to hold on to the information and knowledge that I have because that information is power? And if I feel like I'm going to work with people on it, does that give me a sense of pride, or do I feel like their success might be a threat to my success? And the last one is it safe to be authentic? Am I being me, or am I covering parts of myself, changing the way I would do things, trying to fit into situations in order to feel like I belong into a group? We know that from an LGBT space, given it's Lesbian Visibility Week, that a huge number of LGBT people cover on a regular basis. And cover means either by lying, either by omission, either by being careful about how they phrase things. They're not bringing their whole selves to work, and they're really, I guess, changing or hiding some of the bits of their identity in order to fit. It's really, really damaging. So again, for you, you compare these 4 things, think about which ones of these do you have in your relationships, whether it's at home, whether it's in the workplace, and which ones of these are resonating that perhaps aren't quite there as much as you'd like them to be. And think about how could you start to move these forward. Now, one thing I want to tell you about well-being is we need to make choices. We can absolutely not be 100% successful and focused and energized in all parts of our life. It simply isn't possible. I resisted the urge to use my Wonder Woman picture in this, as I did in my previous webinar, but instead I used one of my grandma's favorite quotes. You can do absolutely anything, but you cannot do everything. So we need to prioritize our time in order to maintain our well-being. We need to make sure we're not stretching ourselves too thin and trying to be everything to everybody. So what we need to think about is, what choices are we making? Where are we spending our time? Where are we spending our energy, so that we're using it impactfully? We're using it to take us forward in the areas we want to, and we're not trying to just cram more and more and more into our energy and time. A great friend of mine talks about this and talks about having 10 spoons of energy. If you've thought less about time and more about your energy, and you thought about having 10 spoons of energy to use every day, what changes would it make to how much you would invest your time and effort and focus into different parts of your day? And this means separating out what's important to what's irrelevant, what's a distraction. What are you doing that doesn't take you where you want to be? What are you doing for other people? What are you doing that you just don't enjoy anymore? What are you doing because you feel like you should? What are you doing that you could do differently? What can you delegate? What can you reprioritize? What can you stop doing? What can you rethink? And what could you even change your value set on? If you're the kind of person, for example, who's a perfectionist, can you practice the art of good enough rather than everything has to be perfect? How often, perhaps in the workplace, have you spent hours on a report? Have you really sweat blood and tears to get the perfect report done, to know that somebody's not even read it for a week, or they have read it and just don't comment on it at all? So reflect on those behaviors and those impacts of what you're doing, and prioritize your energy based on those things. The other thing we can do is really start to set ourselves smaller goals in order to manage our time, so that we're not thinking about the big end goal, we're thinking about the small steps that get us there. That helps in both of thinking how much time we're going to spend on something, but it also helps in thinking about that happiness that we talked about earlier. If you've got small goals that you can see yourself kind of ticking off and moving forward, then it's great for our happiness, versus always looking at the big picture. When I talk to young people, I talk about eating the elephant. Not that obviously we want to eat an elephant, but thinking about, rather than that big, huge outcome that we never quite get to, thinking about the little chunks and how we would start to build those up to make a much bigger whole. So again, just spend some time thinking about mapping out your time. What do you actually do with your day? What's not so important? What are you doing that you don't feel the recognition for? What are you doing that's not helping you move forward? And how can you rethink some of those things? How do we make sure we're doing things that are important and not just emergency or needs doing now? How do we make sure we're really doing that well? Building onto that is understanding those things that give us energy and confidence, and those things that take our energy and confidence away. Now, we can all think about people in our lives that do this, as well as situations. So I want you to think about those people in your life that are like radiators. You go and see them, and after half an hour of being with them, you feel better about the world. You feel like you can do anything at all. You feel really lifted up by spending time with them. They're what we would call our radiators. And then I want you to think about those people who, through no fault of their own, you spend time with them, and you might have gone in feeling really buoyant, but after half an hour with them, you feel kind of low and you feel kind of drained and you feel a bit negative about the word. I call those mood hoovers. They're not doing it intentionally, it's just a different style to you. So we can think about the times in our life when we're feeling more resilient, less resilient, we've got more confidence, we've got less confidence, and how do we make sure in those times we spend more time with the radiators and we minimize the time we need to spend with the hoovers, or we pick the times of the day or times in our week when we feel a little bit more resilient to spend our time with those people. Just spend some time for you mapping out those people and thinking about, actually, is there a pattern of when I spend time with them, and do I find myself drawn more to the hoovers when I'm feeling lower, and does that help me get more further up, or does it just drag me down even further? And how could I switch some of that thinking? Building on from that, think about the things that give you confidence and the things that take your confidence away. Again, it's probably worth just pausing this and making a little note for yourself. What are those situations? What are those things that other people do that give you confidence or take your confidence away? What are those things that you do that give you confidence or take your confidence away? I know I have lucky socks that whenever I'm going for a big important pitch with a client, I always wear my lucky socks. Now, probably it has no impact at all, but it makes me feel more confident knowing I have them on, and undoubtedly that just lifts me up a little bit. So make that note for yourself and start to utilize those things when you feel like you might need more confidence or energy, or you feel like you've got a little bit of a buffer and you can manage those situations. Of course, with those things that other people do that give you confidence or take your confidence away, why not contemplate talking to them about it? Why not contemplate going to see your manager and saying, do you know what, when you say thank you, when you send me an email reflecting on the things I've done well, when you smile at me when I come in the office, it makes such a big deal to my confidence. I'd love it if you could do more. And perhaps the other side of that conversation is, when you send me emails with just one word in, or you don't put hi at the start, I know it's a little thing, but it really does knock my confidence, and I'd love it if you could change that. You'd be amazed how much people are willing to help you and willing to take those things on. 9 times out of 10, they're doing it without thinking. The next thing we can do is think about feeding our brain. Now, our brain needs these 4 chemicals. And I've talked a lot. I'm not going to talk any more about mental health because there are people far more specialized than me to talk about it. But I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to focus a little bit on the brain because I think it's something we don't see enough of. We talk a lot about feeding our body, but what about feeding our brain? You can see here from this chart, and I would encourage you to stop, take a screenshot. If it's on my Twitter is at Harvey Sprout. Take it off my Twitter, please feel free to use it. Really thinking about, when we don't have the right balance of these things in our brain, what does it do to our behavior? So, for example, if you're missing some oxytocin, then you might really feel that lack of motivation. You might feel really disconnected. When your oxytocin is really low, it's those times when you feel like you just can't engage in anything. You feel like an outsider kind of floating around. That's a very common experience. And many of these brain chemicals will lead to insomnia and mood swings and those kind of things as well. So recognize those feelings, as we said earlier, reflect on them, but just go back to this chart and think about what that might mean for some of the chemicals that in our brain that might be higher or lower. And then you can think about how to increase them. So, for example, if that oxytocin is something that you are feeling that you might be making, then a cold shower is something that really, really improves it quickly. Spending time meditating, listening to music, those kind of things can really help. And hugging. We know that having a hug from anybody, assuming you like them in some way, shape, or form, actually produces our oxytocin levels really well. So I'll leave you to read this at your leisure, but do think about the chemicals in the brain in the same way that you might think about, am I hungry? Have I had too many carbs? Have I had enough sugar? Have I drunk enough? Those kind of things as well, because it's vitally important, because the lens that we look through is how we perceive situations. So making sure our brain chemicals are tip top will really help us move out some of those misinterpretations of situations that we often find ourselves in when our well-being is low. I'm just going to put a bit of a shout out to the workplace, because this is a Women at Work conference. So I just really wanted to focus a little bit on how inclusive culture is really key in the workplace for our well-being. Our brains don't know the difference between exclusion and physical pain. It produces exactly the same response. If you're a geeky psychologist like me, please go and look up the cyberball experiment from the University of California. Fascinating and really insightful into how we respond to feeling excluded. And what I've set out here for you is some of the behaviours that you might commonly see if people feel excluded in the workplace, even if they're not articulating it, even if they're doing the fine thing that we talked about earlier. So you will see people really struggling to perform intellectually in the way that you know that they can, or you've seen them to do. You will see self-defeating behavior, people being procrastinating, excluding themselves, really doing things that don't help themselves. You will see impaired self-regulation. So people will become frustrated much quicker than they normally would be. They would lose control. Everything would feel much bigger to them than it would in other situations. And you will also see reduced pro-social behavior. So they're going to be ruder, they're going to be curter, they might not be so pleasant, they might be really quite disruptive in a team. So these are the things that you can see in their behavior. At the same time, they might also be feeling lonely, depressed, lacking sleep, not eating so well, all of those things as well that you may or may not see. So this is just a quick call out to not only think about your own well-being. If you can see these behaviors in yourself at work, perhaps it's telling you something, but also thinking about your colleagues and your peers, or perhaps the people that you manage, and thinking about how important it is to really think about well-being, but also think about inclusion, and that people feel valued and they feel belonged, so that they have not demonstrating these behaviors. So I've given you a lot of information, and what I want you to do with it is to really create your own action plan. So to think about, what have you learned today that you're going to just not go, oh, that was interesting, now I'm going back to do what I've always done, but think about what you might do differently. And think about those little nudges. It doesn't need to be changing your entire life overnight. Think about the little nudges. What one or two little things can you do that perhaps will take you much further towards maintaining positive well-being? Here are some examples and summarizing some of the things that we've talked about. So keeping physically active in whatever that looks like for you, making sure you're eating well, making sure you're sleeping well, doing everything in moderation. So sticking to the moderation and not extremes of anything really helps our brain kind of create patterns and stick within a safety limit. Making sure that you're valuing yourself and you're developing that sense of purpose, that sense of self-worth, those trusting relationships, so you really understand that you are good enough. No matter what journey you're on, no matter how you might be struggling at times, we all struggle at times, but really recognizing that your intention is right and you are good enough and you are worth other people's investment. Talking about your feelings, really staying connected with family and friends. Often when we start to struggle is when we remove our connection at the time when we need it the most. So really making sure you're staying connected with family and friends in whatever way that looks like. Making sure you're caring for others. Caring for others, not only does it make it us feel good about ourselves, it also produces lots of hormones in ourselves that raise up our well-being factors. So it's a great thing to do for the other person, but it's also a great thing to do for you. Get involved, learn new skills, get that sense of purpose, get that sense of achievement. What, again, nothing massive, but just a small thing every day. Doing something creative if that's something for you, and making sure you're taking regular breaks. Whilst we absolutely are spending a lot of time online at the moment, try and stick to the 20-20 rule. Every 20 minutes, take 20 seconds to look at something at least 20 meters away, and that will do you a lot of good. And then last but not least, if you are struggling, if you're finding that your well-being's not where it should be and you're struggling to get it there, absolutely ask for help. No person has ever been successful purely by being an island. So reach out for that boardroom, reach out for people online, reach out to this community, and absolutely people will be there to help you. I'm going to leave you this great diagram. Again, it's on my Twitter. Feel free to take it, because I wanted you to think about your action plan in terms of the broadest set, in terms of not just one piece, but really set it out. I think this is a lovely way of setting it out, to think about those different elements and think about, where am I now? Where would I like to be? And what little steps can I do to take me forward? I hope you found this useful. I will be online to take any questions. Please use it in whichever way works for you, and I hope you have a great day.